Have you ever wondered why your heart races when you hear a siren? It's not magic, it's psychology. Welcome to the intriguing world of classical conditioning, a concept that explains just this and so much more. Coined by the eminent psychologist B.F. Skinner, classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs when two stimuli are repeatedly paired. A response which was originally elicited by the first stimulus is eventually triggered by the second stimulus. Intriguing, isn't it? Let's break it down further. In this theory, the first stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus, and the response to it is the unconditioned response. The second stimulus, initially neutral, is the conditioned stimulus. After pairing, the response to this conditioned stimulus becomes the conditioned response. So in essence, classical conditioning is the process of learning by association, and it's happening around us all the time. A classic example of classical conditioning is Pavlov's experiment with dogs. In the late 19th century, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov made a remarkable discovery while studying the digestive systems of dogs. He noticed that the dogs would salivate at the sight of food, a natural response. This food is what we call an unconditioned stimulus, causing an unconditioned response, the salivation. But Pavlov's real breakthrough came when he introduced a neutral stimulus into the mix. He began to ring a bell every time he fed the dogs. The bell, initially a neutral stimulus, became a conditioned stimulus after repeated pairing with the food. Over time, the dogs began to associate the sound of the bell with the presentation of food. They started to salivate at the sound of the bell alone, even without the food. This salivation in response to the bell was now a conditioned response. So, Pavlov's dogs learned to associate the sound of a bell with food and began to salivate, even without the presence of food. Classical conditioning doesn't just happen in a lab with dogs and bells. It can also explain why we develop certain fears or phobias. Let's take a real-life example. Imagine a child who one day, while happily playing in the park, is bitten by a dog. This traumatic event can create a strong association in the child's mind between dogs and the pain and fear they experienced. This association is so strong that even the mere sight of a dog, regardless of its size or breed, could trigger a fear response in the child. This is because, through classical conditioning, the child has learned to associate dogs with pain and fear. It's important to note that the fear response here is not rational. Not all dogs are dangerous, and being bitten is not a common experience. But to the child, the fear is very real and very potent. So, a child who was bitten by a dog might develop a fear of all dogs, a classic example of classical conditioning. But what happens when we want to unlearn these associations? It's not always smooth sailing. Sometimes we need to break these learned responses, a process known as extinction in classical conditioning. Extinction occurs when the conditioned stimulus, something that was previously neutral, is no longer paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that naturally and automatically triggers a response. Over time, the conditioned response, the learned reaction, decreases and eventually disappears. Consider a simple example. Imagine you've been conditioned to feel hungry at the sound of a dinner bell. But then the bell starts ringing and no food appears. Initially, you might still feel hunger pangs, but over time, as the bell continues to ring without any food in sight, your response will weaken until eventually the bell no longer makes you feel hungry. Through the process of extinction, classical conditioning can be undone, but it might take some time and patience. So, what have we learned about classical conditioning today? We delved into the heart of B.F. Skinner's theory, discovering that classical conditioning is a fundamental learning process where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a significant one. We explored the famous Pavlov's dogs experiment, where the simple sound of a bell eventually led the dogs to salivate, a clear demonstration of how learning through association works. We also examined real-world examples like phobias, how a harmless spider can become a source of fear through an unpleasant experience, showing us that classical conditioning isn't just confined to a lab, it's happening all around us, shaping our behaviors and reactions. Lastly, we touched on the concept of extinction, the process of unlearning a conditioned response. It's a fascinating reminder that our brains are malleable, capable of both learning and unlearning. Remember, classical conditioning is all about learning through association, and it's a fundamental part of how we understand and interact with the world around us.